The first thing Miriam Cole noticed was not the mother, it was the child's thumb. In the photograph, the girl looked 6 years old, maybe 7. She sat perfectly still in a white lace dress, her hair curled into soft rings, her shoes crossed neatly beneath the chair. Everything about her looked arranged, except for one small hand. Her fingers were clamped around her mother's wrist so tightly that the skin beneath them seemed pressed flat, even through the dark sleeve. That was not how children posed for studio portraits. That was how children held on when they were afraid of being taken. Miriam worked in the back room of the Philadelphia Historical Archive, where donations arrived in collapsed trunks, stained envelopes, and boxes labeled by people who had no idea what they were giving away. On a wet November morning, a courier brought in a carton from an estate cleanout near Rittenhouse Square. The label said only, Rittenhouse family papers, cabinet cards, miscellaneous. Inside were the usual ghosts. Men with stiff collars, women with gloved hands, infants propped in chairs, families staring into a camera as if the lens had just accused them of something. Then Miriam reached the photograph. It was a cabinet card from 1901, thick cream board, scalloped edges, the photographer's mark stamped at the bottom in faded gold. Bell and Stroud Studio, Walnut Street, Philadelphia. A young woman sat in a velvet chair beneath a painted arch. She wore a dark, high-necked dress with pearl buttons and a brooch at her throat. The child sat half on her lap, half against her side, dressed in white. To anyone else, it would have looked like a prosperous mother and daughter, a formal portrait, a keepsake. But Miriam had handled thousands of these images. She knew the difference between stiffness and fear. The woman's mouth had been arranged into a polite smile, but her eyes were too wide. Her shoulders were lifted as if she had been holding her breath from the moment the shutter opened. And the child was not looking at the camera. She was looking just past it, at someone standing inside the studio, someone she dreaded. Miriam turned the card over. On the back, in brown ink that had faded almost to dust, someone had written, Marian and Ruth, October 3rd, 1901. Then one line beneath it, I tried to tell them. Miriam did not move for several seconds. The archive room hummed around her. Rain ticked against the narrow windows. A copier clicked somewhere down the hall, but the photograph had gone silent in her hands, because whoever wrote that sentence had not been labeling a memory. They had been leaving a warning. By noon, Miriam had the photograph inside an archival sleeve, a magnifier beside her, and 3 browser windows open on her computer. Marian and Ruth were not enough. In 1901 Philadelphia, those names were everywhere. So she started with the studio. Bell and Stroud had operated on Walnut Street from the late 1890s through 1906, serving the kind of families who paid extra for painted backdrops, imported chairs, and retouching that softened every human flaw. The dress mattered too. The mother's bodice was tailored, not homemade. The lace on the child's collar was fine enough to catch light in individual threads. The shoes were polished kid leather. This was money. Not enormous industrial money, perhaps, but respectable city money. The kind of money that appeared in charity rosters and society notices. Miriam opened the digitized newspaper archive and narrowed the search. Marian, Ruth, October 1901, Philadelphia, Rittenhouse. For hours, she found nothing but wedding breakfasts, church fairs, and visiting relatives. Then she found a notice from October 8th, a small paragraph at the bottom of a society column. Mrs. Marian Alden and her daughter Ruth have left the city for a period of rest in the country. Friends will be relieved to learn that Mrs. Alden is expected to recover from recent nervous exhaustion. Alden. Now the door opened. Charles W. Alden appeared in directories as a partner in Alden, Price and Company, an investment office near Chestnut Street. His residence was listed off Rittenhouse Square. He served on a hospital committee, sat on a church board, and loaned his name to every respectable cause that made a man look generous without requiring him to be kind. Miriam searched Marian Alden. Before October 1901, Marian appeared regularly in society notes. A reception here, a charity supper there, a spring visit with her daughter. After October 8th, she vanished. Charles Alden did not. He attended dinners. He signed letters. He appeared in financial pages. He donated to a children's fund that winter, but his wife and daughter disappeared from print as if they had been folded into the wall. Miriam wrote the first timeline in her notebook. October 3rd, portrait taken. October 8th, newspaper says Marian and Ruth left for rest. After that, Marian gone, Ruth gone, Charles remains. Then she wrote the line from the back of the photograph. I tried to tell them, and beneath it, tell them what? The next morning, Miriam went to the city archives. The reading room smelled of dust, glue, and old radiator heat. An archivist named Mr. Raskin looked over her request form, then glanced at the photograph she had brought in a protective folder. The Aldens, he said quietly. Miriam looked up. You know the name? I know the kind of name. He studied the woman's eyes. Philadelphia made a habit of protecting men like that. He brought her city directories first, then guardianship filings, then court indexes, then records from private institutions that had long ago closed and surrendered their paper bones to the state. There was no death certificate for Marian Alden in 1901, no burial notice, no obituary, no divorce. That absence should have been a relief. Instead, it made Miriam colder, because wealthy women did not simply disappear in 1901 unless someone powerful helped erase them. By late afternoon, she found the first hard record, Fairmount Rest Home for Nervous Disorders, Admission Ledger, October 17, 1901. Marian Alden, age 29. Committed at request of husband, Charles W. Alden. Diagnosis: nervous exhaustion, hysteria, fixed delusions. Patient insists husband has committed grave financial misconduct. Patient becomes agitated when separated from child. Miriam read the line twice. Agitated when separated from child. Then she pulled the next box. Children's Home of St. Bridget. Admission register. October 9th, 1901. Ruth Alden, age 6. Father unable to provide household care due to mother's condition. Child quiet, obedient, frightened at night. October 9th, 6 days after the portrait, 1 day after the newspaper notice. Charles Alden had removed the daughter first. Then he had committed the mother. Miriam sat back from the table, the fluorescent light flattening the page into something almost unreal. The photograph had not been taken for family. It had been taken as proof. Marian Alden had known something was coming. She had dressed her daughter in white, walked into a Walnut Street studio, paid for a portrait, and forced the camera to preserve what words could not protect: their faces, their fear, their last moment together before the law allowed a husband to divide a mother from her child and call it care. Miriam kept digging. Fairmount Rest Home was a private place, expensive enough to avoid scandal, respectable enough to reassure relatives, and discreet enough to bury complaints. Its physicians used the language of science the way other men used locks: hysteria, delusion, agitation, resistance. Every word made Marian sound like the problem. But one note in the margin was more honest than the doctor intended. Patient repeats accusations concerning husband's investment office. Names several clients. Claims ledgers are falsified. That was not madness. That was detail. Miriam left the archive after closing with photocopies, photographs, and a tension in her chest that would not loosen. She had a mother in an institution, a child in a home, a husband with money, and one accusation the official record kept calling delusion. The next file had to be financial. It took 3 days to follow Charles Alden through bank directories, court indexes, and sealed case summaries. Alden, Price and Company had specialized in private investments for widows, old families, and church trusts. The firm promised safe returns in rail bonds, municipal notes, and insurance-backed funds. On paper, Charles looked flawless. Then Miriam found the withdrawals. In September 1901, 3 clients quietly removed large accounts from the firm. One was a widow. One was a church treasurer. One managed a trust for 2 orphan children. The newspaper mentioned the matter only once, in language designed not to disturb breakfast. Questions have been raised regarding the management practices of a well-known Chestnut Street investment house. No name, no accusation, no scandal. But 2 months later, a civil suit was filed against Charles W. Alden, alleging misapplication of entrusted funds. The suit was settled before trial. The record was sealed. The plaintiff stopped speaking, and Marian Alden was already locked away. Miriam stared at the docket until the ink seemed to move. Marian had not been delusional. She had discovered the theft, maybe in a ledger left open, maybe in letters hidden inside a desk, maybe by hearing the wrong conversation from the hallway. However it happened, she had named the crime before the clients dared to, and Charles had understood the danger immediately. A wife in 1901 could be dismissed as fragile, hysterical, overexcited. A husband with a church title and an investment office could turn his own crime into her illness. All he needed was the signature of 2 doctors and a society willing to believe that respectable men did not need to explain themselves. There was still one person Miriam had not followed: Ruth. The children's home records were thin, but thin records sometimes cut deepest. October 12th. Child asked repeatedly for mother. Says, "Mama told me not to let him take me." October 19th. Night terrors continue. Child wakes and hides beneath bed. November 2nd. Child drew picture of house with barred windows. When asked, she said, "That is where Mama is." Miriam had to stop reading. 6 years old. Old enough to understand terror. Too young to understand paperwork. There were no letters from Marian in Ruth's file. No proof that the child had been told where her mother was. But somehow Ruth knew. Maybe she heard servants whisper. Maybe she guessed. Maybe Marian, in the last hours before Charles separated them, had pressed the truth into her daughter in the only language a child could carry. "Do not forget me." Then in December, a new name appeared. Miss Beatrice Wren requests visitation. Claims to be maternal aunt. States that child has been wrongfully placed. Beatrice Wren. Miriam wrote it down so hard the pencil point broke. Beatrice lived in Germantown and taught older girls at a private academy. She had never married. She had her own rented rooms, her own income, and just enough independence to make men nervous. Her letters filled the back half of Ruth's file. The first was formal. I wish to see my niece Ruth Alden and make arrangements for her care. The home's reply was polite and evasive. The father must be consulted. Beatrice wrote again. I have consulted Mr. Alden and found him unwilling to answer even the simplest question about his wife or child. Marian is my sister. Ruth is my blood. I insist upon seeing the child. Then Charles answered through a lawyer. Miss Wren is not to be granted access. Her influence has been injurious to Mrs. Alden's mental condition. Any further interference will be regarded as harassment. After that, the official file went quiet, but Beatrice had not. Miriam found her in another collection 2 days later, in a university archive that had received a box of teaching papers in the 1960s. Most of it was ordinary. Attendance lists, poetry exercises, receipts for coal, a bundle of student essays tied with blue ribbon. At the bottom was a diary from 1901. The cover was cracked. The pages smelled faintly of smoke. Miriam turned to October. October 16th. I have learned that Ruth has been placed at St. Bridget's. Charles refuses to receive me. His clerk says Mrs. Alden is resting. I do not believe him. October 20th. Saw Ruth today after threatening to retain counsel. The child clung to me and would not release my sleeve. She asked if I had come to take her to Mama. I could not answer without lying. October 26th. A lawyer tells me Charles has full authority unless Marian can testify to her own sanity. How is she to do that from behind locked doors? Then, November 7th, I have found Marian, Fairmount Rest Home. I went there this morning. They tried to turn me away, but I said I would stand in the street and call her name until the neighbors came to their windows. They brought her into a small parlor. She was thinner. Her hair was pinned badly. There were bruises on one wrist, yellow at the edges. But her mind was clear, clearer than mine, perhaps. She told me Charles has stolen from clients for nearly 3 years. She found account books hidden behind the false panel of his writing desk. When she confronted him, he struck the table so hard that Ruth began to cry. The next day, she took Ruth to Bell and Stroud. She said if no one believed her words, perhaps someone might one day believe their faces. Miriam lowered the diary. Their faces. That was why the child was gripping her mother's wrist. That was why Marian's eyes looked as if she were trying to speak without moving her mouth. The photograph was not a keepsake. It was testimony. Beatrice's next entry was dated November 9th. I told Marian I would bring a lawyer. She begged me to take Ruth first. She said Charles would use the child to punish her. When the attendant came, Marian stood and said, "Tell them I am not ill. Tell them to look at the photograph." The pages after that had been torn out, not cut, torn. There were ragged edges left near the spine, as if someone had removed them in a hurry. Miriam searched the rest of the collection until evening. In a separate envelope marked private, she found what Beatrice had not dared leave in the diary. A letter, unsigned, dated December 1901. Charles has threatened my employment, my reputation, and my freedom. His attorney delivered papers accusing me of defamation. The Academy has asked for my resignation to avoid unpleasant association with scandal. I am told that no court will interfere in a husband's lawful decisions unless proof can be produced. But the proof exists. Marian made it. I have hidden the photograph where it may survive me. If I cannot save her, perhaps I can at least prevent him from destroying the last witness. Miriam sat alone in the reading room, long after the staff began stacking chairs. Beatrice had failed in every practical way. She had lost access. She had lost her position. She had lost the legal fight before it began. But she had preserved the one object Charles had not understood. He could seal court records. He could hire doctors. He could threaten a teacher. He could move a child. But he could not make terror look like peace. The next record was worse. In January 1902, Marian was transferred from Fairmount Rest Home to a state hospital outside Norristown. The reason given was simple: persistent resistance, poor prognosis, family unable to continue private care. Family. The word made Miriam's mouth tighten. The hospital file was thicker than expected. For a moment, she felt hope. A thick file meant letters, complaints, visitors, maybe attempts at release. Instead, it was a record of slow erasure. February 1902. Patient remains convinced husband has wronged her. Demands child. Refuses sedative. April 1902. Patient calmer after isolation. Continues to speak of ledgers and daughter. September 1903. Less combative. Shows signs of resignation. June 1905. Patient asks whether Ruth is living. No answer recorded. No answer recorded. That was the cruelty of the file. It documented the doctor's confidence, not Marian's pain. It measured whether she had become quiet, not whether she had been wronged. By 1908, the notes were shorter. Woman withdrawn. No family visits. Works in sewing room. By 1913, her name appeared on a death certificate. Marian Alden, age 41. Cause: pneumonia. No husband present. No daughter present. Burial arranged by institution. Miriam copied the document, then sat with her hand over it. Marian had entered the system as a woman making accurate accusations against a powerful husband. She died 12 years later as a line in a ledger. That was the system working exactly as it was designed to work. Ruth's file continued. She remained at St. Brigid's until 1904, when Charles Alden reclaimed her. No explanation, no apology. The census later listed Ruth in his household as a daughter with no occupation, no schooling noted after age 12, and no servants in the home. The prosperous house off Rittenhouse Square had grown quieter, poorer, and meaner. Charles had settled enough snuff claims to survive publicly, but not enough to keep the old household running as it once had. Ruth became what many daughters became when men destroyed the women before them: useful, silent, trapped. At 19, she married a streetcar mechanic named Samuel Pike and moved to a narrow row house in South Philadelphia. Miriam expected the trail to fade there. Instead, Ruth came back into the record under a different kind of paper, not society columns, not court filings against her, petitions, letters, testimony. By the 1930s, Ruth Pike was volunteering with a child welfare group that investigated neglect, institutional abuse, and custody disputes. One letter, written to a judge in 1937, made Miriam read more slowly. Your Honor, a child's silence must not be mistaken for consent. A frightened child often appears obedient because obedience is the only shield available. Before you accept the father's account, I ask that you hear the girl privately and ask what she fears. Miriam felt the room fall away. Ruth had never forgotten. She may not have known every detail of the financial crime. She may not have known every year her mother spent behind hospital walls, but she knew what it meant to be called difficult by adults who wanted convenience. She knew what it meant for a child to watch power become paperwork. And she had spent the rest of her life trying to keep other children from disappearing the way she had. The obituary was small. Ruth Alden Pike, age 72, remembered for quiet service on behalf of vulnerable children. No mention of her mother, no mention of the photograph, no mention of the 6-year-old girl in white lace who once clung to a woman everyone later called insane. But the obituary named one daughter, Grace. Grace Pike had married, moved to Delaware County, and had children of her own. By the time Miriam found her, Grace was 92 years old and living with her granddaughter, Lydia, in a brick house with geraniums along the front steps. Miriam called first. She explained who she was. She said she had found a family photograph and some records that belonged to their history. There was a long silence on the line. Then Grace said, "My mother used to dream about a room with no handle on the door." Miriam drove there the next morning. She carried a folder of copies, the photograph in its sleeve, and a fear she had not expected. What if the family did not want this? What if truth, after a century, was only another injury? Grace sat at the kitchen table in a pale blue sweater, her hands thin but steady. Lydia sat beside her with a notebook, ready for dates, names, anything that could finally explain the quiet places in their family. Miriam placed the photograph on the table. Grace leaned forward. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then her eyes filled. "That is my mother," she whispered. "I know her face." Lydia looked from the child to Miriam. She never had any photographs from when she was little. She told us there were none. Miriam nodded. There was one, and I think her mother made sure it survived. She told them everything. Not all at once. Not brutally. She began with the portrait, then the newspaper notice, then Ruth's admission to St. Bridget's, then Marian's commitment, then Beatrice Wren, the aunt who tried to fight and lost, then Charles Alden's sealed financial case, then Marian's 12 years in the hospital, then Ruth's later work with children. Grace did not interrupt. Lydia cried quietly when Miriam read the line from Beatrice's diary. If no one believed her words, perhaps someone might one day believe their faces. Grace touched the sleeve with one finger. "My mother never said her mother abandoned her," she said. "People assumed that. She would only say, 'She tried.' I never knew what that meant." Miriam opened the last folder. "This is Ruth in 1937, she said, writing to a judge for a frightened girl. Grace read the letter. Her mouth trembled. "She became the person she needed," Lydia said softly. Miriam looked at the photograph again. Marian's eyes, Ruth's grip, the forced stillness of a beautiful room. "That portrait waited 122 years, Miriam said, for somebody to stop calling it a family picture. Over the next several months, Miriam worked with Grace, Lydia, and the archive to reconstruct the Alden case. They did not try to make it cleaner than it was. Charles Alden had never faced public disgrace. He died with a polished obituary that called him a respected financier and civic-minded gentleman. The men who signed Marian's commitment papers remained doctors. The institution that buried her recorded no apology. History did not suddenly become fair because someone found the right document. But the record changed. That mattered. The archive mounted a small exhibition in the winter. At the center was the photograph. not enlarged too much, not dramatized. Just lit carefully behind glass, with the back displayed beside it. Marian and Ruth, October 3rd, 1901. I tried to tell them. Nearby were the records that proved she had, the admission ledger, the child's file, Beatrice's diary, the sealed case summary, Ruth's letter to the judge. Visitors came expecting an old photograph. They left understanding that a photograph can be a witness. Some stood in front of it for a long time, trying to reconcile the velvet chair and painted arch with the panic in two pairs of eyes. Grace came on opening night in a wheelchair, Lydia behind her. She asked to be taken close to the glass. For nearly a minute, she looked at her mother as a child and her grandmother as a young woman. Then she said, not loudly, but clearly enough for Miriam to hear, "We believe you now." That was all. No speech could have improved it. No plaque could have said it better. A century earlier, Marian Alden had stood in a studio with a child pressed against her and understood that the world might refuse her voice. So she left another kind of voice, a held wrist, a frightened eye, a line of ink on the back of a card. Charles Alden trusted documents because documents belonged to men like him. But he forgot that some truths do not need permission to survive. They hide in boxes. They wait in dust. They stare out of old photographs until somebody finally looks long enough to see what everyone else was trained to ignore. The record had called Marianne delusional. The photograph called her honest. And after 122 years, the photograph won.